Hello, Codegarden, and hello, everyone. My name is Joe Glombek. I'm an Umbraco developer at Bump, and as of today, I am an Umbraco MVP. I'm also a certified expert and on the core collaborators team. I'm not going to give out my email address like everyone in the last one, but you can contact me on Twitter or in the Umbracian Slack as well, and please do. Now, because this is a virtual conference, it's quite difficult for you to relate to me, right? So there's a radio DJ in the UK who has a call-in show where people can voice their unpopular opinions. And sometimes this really helps me relate to a complete stranger. So maybe it'll help you relate to me, or maybe you'll think I'm absolutely insane. We'll see. So Pepsi tastes better than Coke. Light mode is better than dark mode. And cats are evil. So yeah, if you want to get in touch about any of those, do give me a shout. But onto the serious stuff. It's a dark and stormy night, and you wake up with a start. Is that the looming feeling of .NET 5 and Umbraco 9 on the horizon? Are you shaken to the core about .NET 5? Hopefully, if this is you, I can instill some calm today. There are a lot of changes, but taking one thing at a time, it's not as daunting as it might initially sound. So in case you missed the memo and you've been asleep for the past few talks, Umbraco 9 won't be running on .NET Framework. All the buzz about Umbraco 9, Unicore, .NET Core, .NET 5 all boils down to this. Umbraco will be running on the brand new .NET 5. And for many people I've spoken to, this is a really terrifying prospect. The way we've been working for years or even decades is about to change in a big way, and it's hard to find the time to upskill ourselves and our teams while we're working on earlier Umbraco versions. And as Philip said earlier, a lot has stayed the same, but there are some things that have changed. I'm going to touch on a few of these things, but I think will have the biggest impact on the majority of us. So what is .NET 5? .NET 5 is the next step for both the .NET Framework and .NET Core, and it's going to be taking over from .NET Standard and Mono, the previous open source version of .NET as well. And it opens up a lot of opportunities for us as developers. And words like Linux, Docker, containerization, Visual Studio Code, .NET templates, they're popping up all over the place in the Umbraco world. But that's a lot of change to all happen at once. So let's take a moment to breathe and work out what's important and what we can put off for a rainy day. So how do we get started with an Umbraco 9 project? You might have heard about using .NET templates in the command line and using Visual Studio Code, which you can do, and they are brilliant. But one change at a time, hey? So for now, let's stick with Visual Studio and create a new Umbraco site using the new project dialog. It's worth noting that you will need to enable .NET Core templates in Visual Studio settings first. But for me, this was already enabled, so you might not need to do it yourself. And if you're working now, you'll also need to add the Umbraco Beta NuGet repository, but this won't be required once Umbraco 9 launches. But with those caveats out the way. After you've done that, it's as simple as searching for Umbraco in the new project window. We'll select an Umbraco project, and you'll actually see some improvements from what you're used to in installing Umbraco 8, thanks to the unattended install process. So next, you'll be presented with this dialog. It will allow you to configure your site without having to go through the Umbraco installer. It's worth noting, though, if you want to use SQL CE, you need to check it at this point. Umbraco ships without this by default. It's because it's Windows only, so you won't get the option of using a SQL CE connection string on the installer if you don't tick it now. So that's really important. You can also configure your user at this step. But at the moment, you can't use the unattended install with a SQL CE database, so pick one or the other. I've also been informed that if you need to make sure at the moment, if you're using the beta, that these strings will work okay in JSON without any escapes as well. So it's just something to be careful of, but I'm sure they'll be sorted out before the launch happens. And after that, we're presented with a new Umbraco site. It might look a little bit different. We'll come on to that later. But what you can do is just hit debug in IIS button. No need to use .NET Serve if you don't want to. And you'll see the installer we all know. Or if you use the unintended install process, you'll be flung straight into an empty Umbraco site. So let's give that a go. Got my Visual Studio new project, Visual Studio window here, and I'm going to create a new project. Just stick Umbraco in the search there, and we got the choice of the Umbraco package or Umbraco project. So I'll select the Umbraco project and click next. Umbraco Project 5 is a fine name for this demo, not recommended in real life though. And then we come across this dialog here, at which point I'm going to set my connection string, set my username, my email, and my password, and I hit create. This should come up with a brand new Umbraco project. I'm not going to do anything with the code at the moment. I'm just going to hit IIS Express. And because we use the unintended install process, we should just be launched straight in to an empty Umbraco site with any luck. But this is a live demo, so you never know. It's just building the project now, downloading everything from NuGet. Of course, this takes longer when you're also streaming your build succeeded, fantastic. It's opened a browser window for us, drum roll. Come on, you can run a stream and a website at the same time. So hopefully what we're going to see here is the fresh fresh empty install page, and we should be able to click the link and log in to Umbraco. One day in the future. All right, maybe we'll come back to that. It's not the same if you pre-record it, Matt. Let's jump back to that. I promise you it does work. So things do look a little bit different in the Solution Explorer, though, as we saw, but it's not too much to be afraid of. Your views, controllers, and other pieces of code will all live in the usual folders. The main difference you need to be aware of is the www root folder. And this is where your static assets are going to live. So that's your compiled JS, CSS, and related assets. Anything outside this folder will not be served to the browser, except through the routing that Umbraco sets up. So it's a nice peace of mind and safe security rules in your web config, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. You will notice that the old Umbraco folder is now split. So there's Umbraco in the root here, but there's also an Umbraco folder in the www root folder, depending on the use case of the files that are in there. And that's a good pattern to follow. Another change you'll notice is the lack of web config file, or any config file for that matter, and the addition of an app settings.json file, which is one of the biggest changes you'll see in .NET 5, and that's with configuration. Everything now is an app setting. You'll also find some things have moved, but almost everything that was in a .config file will now be an app settings.json. So helpfully in Visual Studio Code, you get IntelliSense for all the property names in app settings.json, even those specific to Umbraco. Unfortunately, Visual Studio doesn't support the schema. I wouldn't hold your breath for that either. And it's still perfectly usable in Visual Studio, and it's no worse than it would have been using .NET 4, but it's worth noting this is a big plus for VS Code. And because it's JSON, rather than key value pairs in a web config file, settings can now be hierarchical, as you can see here. So this means you'll find all your Umbraco related settings under Umbraco, or your logging settings under Serilog, usync settings under usync, and so on. And if you're using an app setting source that only allows key value pairs, so if you're using the Azure Web App entry, for example, or environment variables, you can replicate this structure using a double underscore. So here where we've got the models builder models directory, we just have that as Umbraco _ models builder _ models directory. So we can still do that. I really love this new hierarchy of all the settings that this provides. You can also customize the config sources and pull different values from different places and different environments. I'm in love with this configuration, and it's what we should have had all along. So I'm really happy that we can use it now in Umbraco as well. As for the changes to .NET itself, Laura puts it best. So using .NET 5 is a bit like being in someone else's kitchen. You know there's stuff that should be there. It might just be in a slightly different place. There might be new things, and some of the old things might not be there anymore. This is undoubtedly the biggest change when moving to .NET 5. Libraries have changed, and code you're used to writing won't work anymore. It can be a little discombobulating. That all said, the concepts are generally the same. It's still a kitchen. It may be a different container, but it's still dependency injection. It may have a slightly different name, but it's still the same method. It might be a completely different library, but it's still going to fit the same purpose. In Laura's analogy, I know there's a cutlery drawer here somewhere, I just need to find it. And if you're anything like me, and you're a heavy user of IntelliSense when you're coding, you should be fine. And anytime you'd usually be using a NuGet package, you might just need to do a quick Google search first. As for packages, there are some pretty drastic changes to the code base to make Umbraco work in .NET 5 and in a .NET 5 way. This means package developers have had to do a fair chunk of work to get their packages ready for Umbraco 9. However, packages are a big factor in deciding whether or not to upgrade to V9 or not. So let's have a rundown of some of the big ones. It is worth noting that all packages that are front-end only with no C# should just work fine in V9. The back office hasn't changed. And there's been a number of developers who've said their packages just worked. Umbraco forms and deploy. You've heard from Andy today. HQ have said that the official Umbraco packages will be in place by the time V9 ships. Usync, Kevin Jump has already released a beta of Usync, but there's no releases yet of Usync Complete or Usync Content Edition though. Vendor development is underway. Doc type grid editor, Soren has plans to complete before V9 launch, which is fantastic. Skipped a slide. And contentment is in active development. It's also worth noting I can't find any word on UCommerce or SEO checker. I did also have in my notes that I didn't know about the Umbraco file system providers, but we've already covered that earlier, and HQ will be open sourcing the one that cloud uses, so that's good news as well. All right, so extendability. A lot of extension points in Umbraco 8 still exist reasonably unchanged in V9. So you've still got your content apps, dashboards, front-end add-ons can still be created in code and or package.manifest files. But for custom code, there are some changes. If you wanted to extend Umbraco in the past, there's a high chance you'd turn to events, but these no longer exist in V9. I'm sure there's a pun in here somewhere about events being a thing of the past, but I can't work out exactly what it is. Instead, we have notifications. So how do we use notifications? We still create a composer, but instead of reaching for content service.saved plus equals, we're going to add a notification handler instead. So in our composer, we trigger an add notification handler with a type parameter of the relevant notification class. In the example here, we're using content save notification, which is the replacement for content service.saved. And the easiest way to work out what notification you need is to use IntelliSense. So fill in the namespace Umbraco CMS core notifications, hit control space, and you'll see a whole list of them pop up. The next parameter is the notification handler class. This is your custom code. And that's going to look a bit like this. So we're going to implement the iNotification handler interface, makes sense, with the notification type as the type parameter. Implementing the interface's handle method gives you an object very similar to the content saved event args that you're used to from previous versions of Umbraco. As you can see here in the example, I'm just looping through those saved entities. So that, beyond that point, is pretty much the same. How about upgrading then? So your content will upgrade fine. There's no database schema updates, so a V8 database will work in V9, probably. However, packages, views, and custom code will be your issue. So this is how I'd approach a conversion. So first of all, I check whether those packages exist in V9. Failing that, check for an alternative. Same with the NuGet packages. Check your NuGet packages for .NET 5 versions or alternatives. Then you're going to install a brand new V9 instance of Umbraco and point it at a copy of a V8 database and check that the content works. You can also use usync, though, to bring across your schema and content. So that's another potential change there. And then we can install the relevant Umbraco and NuGet packages, all via NuGet. And we can migrate our views, tweak any code to make it compatible, and migrate your custom logic using composers, components, and the new notifications pattern we just talked about. There's plenty of time for another demo, and I'll also prove to you that the last demo did work as well. And drum roll, if I can find the right edge window, all the way over there. Nope, that one. So there's the install complete page. So if I click open Umbraco, it'll be slow again, of course. And I should be able to log in with my joe@example.com. And there you go, we've got a fresh Umbraco 9 install. But let's take this a step further. So I said that you could connect this to an old V8 database, right? So let's give that a go. Let's open up Visual Studio again. And grab a connection string for an existing database that I've got. So if I go into app settings.development.json, which is where the local connection string is, and point that to a existing database that I had set up for the load balancing training, apparently, and give this a little restart. I've made the same rookie mistake again, haven't I? Don't try to live stream and use Visual Studio at the same time. So the front end isn't going to work, so let's just skip that. There's all sorts of code in there that I haven't migrated over, but the content should be fine and should just come straight through from the Umbraco 8 database. Post and install. Come on, computer. We'll come back to this one as well. Okay, so once you've got your head around .NET 5 and Umbraco 9, what else can we do with it? Well, first of all, watch the next session. The Umbraco 9, the next major version, is going to go into what I've skimmed over in much more detail, so 100% stick around for that. But what's next for you to explore once you've finally got your teeth into these? First thing you might want to look at is Docker or containerization. It makes a lot more sense now Umbraco is on .NET 5. It might be worth investigating, especially if you have a complex solution with multiple applications. Personally, I expect this will be a bit overkill for the majority, but it might be worth it for some of you. Linux is cheaper than Windows, so it might be worth investigating Linux for your hosting. There are no license fees, which means lower startup costs for VPS hosting and lower monthly costs for cloud hosting. But do bear in mind the time and cost of testing your website on a new platform. For example, case sensitivity isn't something we've had to think about much before. and also time implications of learning the new skills required for DevOps on Linux. It's not going to be a quick buck maker necessarily. Another thing you might want to look at is your IDE. You might be able to swap out your IDE now. So Visual Studio can be a little bit cumbersome. Once you've got your head around .NET 5, it might be worth looking at Visual Studio Code and the .NET CLI. They're fast, they're modern, but they do take a little bit of time to get used to. Once you've swapped out your IDE, you can also swap out your OS. So Visual Studio Code is cross-platform. Prior to being a .NET dev, I was a Linux user for many years. So once you switch to Visual Studio Code, why not swap out your operating system as well? I think the most important step is to play, right? We've got some new technology available to us that's faster, leaner, and more modern. Other developers are excited about .NET 5, and there are some pretty neat projects popping up all over the place. So get inspired by them and do some inspiration yourself. Let's see what Umbraco 9 and .NET 5 can do. Speaking of which, let's see if my computer can do. I can find the right Edge window. Oh, no luck. It worked earlier. Oh, there we go. Let's run the upgrade. It's not going to do very much, so it doesn't take too long. Install is complete. There we go. So we've brought across all the content from that database that I had already, which is using a starter kit, but I'm not confident enough to say which one. And as Carl says in the chat, he's demoing Linux tomorrow. I believe it's on the Raspberry Pi. So that's definitely worth investigating. And my slides have crashed. No, they're over there. So thank you very much. There's my contact details again. The blog post should have published as well that goes along with this talk. So if you need to see any of this again in more detail and with links, you can go to joe.gl and all those details will be there for you. Thank you very much.